So I'm extremely excited for this programming tonight, and I'd actually like to call everybody up here now, and I'll introduce you while you're on stage. So Jonathan, if you want to come have a seat, Sinead. So I'm first going to introduce Jason, and I'll tell you why. He was the first one who I met. This was back in January of this year, and actually I thought that A Species Between Worlds would be open to New Yorkers in January. And because of COVID and supply chain issues, we postponed it until May. And Jason and I sort of lost contact during that time, and then the show was postponed again because of COVID for the month of September. And it's just sort of, when we started planning the programming here, I remembered, wait, I had spoken to Jason, we need to make sure that he's here. And I'm really, really thankful that he didn't fall through the cracks, because there was a lot of movement in that time. So thank you for being here. And it's really a pleasure to finally meet you, because you've been a flat person on a flat screen. So this is great, much better than virtual reality. So let me just read this about Jason. Jason Steinhauer is the best-selling author of History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. He is also a public historian, podcast host, founder of the History Communication Institute, and creator of History Club, and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I will introduce Sinead Bovell, and the reason I'm doing her next is because she was the second person who I met in this journey. She was here with us with Tristan Harris on stage, which was a wonderful, wonderful night. Sinead Bovell is a futurist and the founder of Way, a tech education company that prepares youth for a future with advanced technologies. To date, she has educated over 200,000 young entrepreneurs on the future of technology and has spoken at world-renowned institutions, including the United Nations, Cornell University, and Bloomberg, on the intersection of business, technology, and the future. Sinead, again, thanks so much for being here another time. Jonathan Haidt is the last person that I've met on this journey. Actually, today is the first time I've met him. And I want to thank Jonathan twice tonight. And the first thanks goes because I'm going to guess 2 months ago, I have a daughter, she's 15 years old, and I live in Spain. And she is really one of these victims of everything going on in social media. And I listened to a talk that John gave on YouTube, and I thought to myself, I think my daughter should watch this with me. So I pulled it up and we watched the YouTube video together. And John was talking about 15-year-old teenage girls, what they're going through, the fear of missing out. And I sat down with my daughter and we went through it, and I just pretty much asked her, how much of this sort of applies to you? And we go through sort of each thing, we took notes, and she said, well, this thing's sort of 80%. This thing not so much, this thing 20%. But it really got her thinking. And it was the first time I realized, wow, I can actually open up to her a community of people that are talking about these issues so that she doesn't think I'm the only one that thinks this way. So I really want to thank John, because he enabled me to be the father by being the bad guy. So thank you for that. So Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. His research examines the intuitive foundations of morality and how morality varies across cultural and political divisions. Haidt is the author of several New York Times best-selling novels, including The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. Since 2018, he has studied the contribution of social media to the decline of teen mental health and the rise of political dysfunction. Jonathan Haidt, thank you for being here. Take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for such a warm introduction for all of us. Now, Jason, I'll start with you. And this is the first time I've actually interviewed a historian before, so I'm very excited about that.
Hopefully not the last.
So how do you think historians of the future will describe the state of democracy, society, and culture in America right now?
Thanks for that softball question.
Really easy, low-hanging fruit.
Well, can I just firstly make an interjection? I want to thank John for inviting us here, but also creating this space. There's a lot of talk about leadership, right? Leadership studies, leadership literature, whatever. For me, I think about, to be a good leader, you have to be a space creator. You have to create spaces where other people can shine and thrive, where you can create platforms upon which people stand and have conversations and think critically about things. And when I think about this space that John has created in the heart of New York City, bringing all of these different people together from different backgrounds and different walks of life, to me, that is just an impressive and remarkable feat of leadership. So I don't know if we can take a minute just to thank John. What was your question again? I'm just kidding. So let me say this. I mean, historians, we think about the past, and we try to figure out as accurately as possible what happened in the past. We're not really in the business of predicting the future, okay? And because there's a lot of variables about the future that we don't know yet. So when I do get asked this question from time to time about historians of the future. Now, first of all, I will say, if you read my book, you will know that one of my concerns is that there actually may not be historians of the future, because history has been chronically underfunded for years, not just the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. History departments are being shut down, museums are losing their funding, historians are having trouble finding jobs, many historians are bouncing around from project to project without stability. And I make the argument in the book that one of the factors behind this is that there is so much history available for free online that people now wonder why they should pay for it. And not just consumers of historical information, but governments, universities. So one of the arguments I've been making as I've made the rounds on this book tour is talk about how we need more funding in the world of professional history. We need to, everyone says history is important. Everyone knows that we should study history, but no one's actually willing to step up and fund it and give support to it. So if we don't fund historical scholarship and historical research, there will be no historians of the future. And then if there are historians in the future, they're going to be writing and thinking about all kinds of different things, including democracy, but also technology and disease and public health and all these other things. And what they think about and write about largely depends on the actions that we take now.
And so with that, if people were to make that argument, we don't necessarily need history, we have access to all of this information. What is the difference between being aware and understanding in the context of history? What would you say to those who believe that they're more informed because we have access to all of this information? Can we even process it all?
Right, well, I appreciate that distinction between awareness and understanding. I said that in a previous talk, so maybe you did your research.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I'm aware of gravity. I have no idea how it works, right? And there's a lot of people who are aware of different histories now that there's all this information online, there's Wikipedia pages, there's social media feeds, etc. But being aware of something, being aware that there is such a thing as Black history, doesn't actually help you understand Black history. You have to do the research, and that is where historians come in. Historians are the people who do the research to help us really understand with depth and accuracy and seriousness what is the trajectory of the Black American experience, and how does that experience then play out and manifest itself in various time periods. I'm just using that as one example. So I think what sometimes happens on social media and in other areas of the web is we conflate those two things. We conflate awareness with understanding. But I think it's important, and I've argued this and will continue to argue it, that in order to really better assess where we are, we have to know where we've been. And to understand where we've been, we need professional historical scholarship.
And Jonathan, how would you describe the state of democracy in society and culture right now?
Pretty bad, but let me actually first, if I could add a little something to what Jason said. So I'm writing 2 books. Now, one is on how social media has devastated Gen Z, especially girls, and the other is what it's doing to democracy. And the title of that book is Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We Can Never Again Share. I think we're on the cusp of something very big, and while most of technology is wonderful, I think there are a few parts, especially social media, that are so incompatible with liberal democracy, given the flaws we've known about since the founders or since Plato, that I think historians may look back on us the way we look back on people in the 1850s or 1913 in Europe or the 1930s in Europe and America, and think, they're on the cusp of this major event, and you could see, is it inevitable? Like, with World War I, it wasn't inevitable, but with World War II, maybe it was. I don't want to open that can with an actual historian near me, but I'm just saying, I think historians will look back sort of the way we look back on other eras just before major changes. And the other kind of history that I think is so relevant, I'm just beginning to read, is the history of technology. Because when you get a major technological change, it ripples through society, governance, consciousness, everything. And so the question is the internet is wonderful, and all the research I'm doing says it's not the internet that's the problem, it's specifically a subset of social media. And the question is this going to be disruptive the way, say, television was disruptive? Or is it going to be disruptive, say, the way the printing press was disruptive? And I think it's going to be the printing press.
And you wrote an incredible article. You said I think it was one of the most important pieces you've ever written. For anybody who hasn't read it or maybe finds it difficult to understand, how would you summarize the pre-2009 social media impact on society and democracy, the post-2009, and why we might be in some of the situations we're in today?
Sure. So I think many people here are old enough to remember the 1990s and the incredible optimism, not just from the fall of communism and the victory of liberal democracy, which we thought, like, we won, we're done, end of history. Let's just wait for North Korea and Iran to get a little bit of wealth, and they'll want rights, and like liberal democracy all the way. And that was before we saw the internet. And then the internet comes in. Oh my God, like the greatest gift to democracy ever. And everybody can get everything, and we can hear from everyone. Everyone's got a voice. And then these Google and all the world's books and cars will just come pick you up. I mean, it was just miracle after miracle. Until about 2012, that's when everything began to turn. And what I argue in this Atlantic article is that early social media was fine. Like, connecting people is great. Technology is generally great. And it was really fun at first and very positive. The key change, everything turns when Facebook adds the like button, Twitter copies it as the share button, or other way around, that way. I'm sorry, they both have the like button. Twitter adds the retweet button, which makes everything go super viral, and then Facebook copies it. And this defines the business model for a number of platforms, this engagement-based. That's when everything turns. And the one additional innovation I didn't know about when I wrote the article was threaded comments. That comes into 2013. Threaded comments is a way of saying, people aren't engaged enough. How about if everybody can fight with everybody within the thread of a famous person's post? So every nobody, every troll who has 3 followers can now fight with people in public. And so we go from technology helping us to connect with people to, before we knew it, technology had pulled us in so that everything is taking place for free with the world in the middle of the Roman Colosseum. And the stands are full of people who've paid to see blood. And so that is now our civic life. And that's why I say liberal democracy cannot survive if that's what our public square is. So that's basically what I'm arguing in this article. I'm laying out how the technology changed society so quickly in ways that sort of tap directly into what James Madison worried about in Federalist 10, which is faction, our tendency to divide ourselves into factions that fight. And then just to close up, I know I'm talking a long time here. The key thing that is really new, because if some of you have read any of my books, I've been worried about polarization and the left-right battle for 15 years now. What's new with social media in the 2010s is that it's not that it's just ramping up left-right, it's that it's fragmenting everything. So if you are involved with left-wing politics, good luck. Everyone's just fighting with everyone now. The right is better at coming together. They have more loyalty and group cohesion on the right, but they have group cohesion in a way that has pulled them so far away from conservative. It has nothing to do with conservatism. It's just a crazy, we don't want to go too much into value or details here. The point is, it's fragmenting everything, and that's my real fear.
And I know things seem quite dire and dystopian, but I will say, if you zoom in to what he had said about the design decisions of engineers, so while it does feel all-consuming and overwhelming, a few switches on a computer change the course of democracy, which also means the solutions are largely within our control.
Potentially within our control.
Potentially. And so one argument is that over time, technology changes ethics, it changes governance, it changes networks. How much of it are we trying to preserve and insulate democracy in our institutions, and how much should be updating? Is there a new story for the 21st century we should maybe be subscribing to altogether?
May I go first, Jason? You want me to take this?
Love the no small questions rule. That's great. So I have a couple things. So I want to quibble a little bit with Jonathan as politely as possible, but I think as a historian, I'm a little cautious to say that it's one or two switches on a computer that change the whole course of history, right? There's a sort of genre of talking about the past that sort of relies on inflection points. And it says that like, at this moment, everything changed. And like literally there's 700 books out there you can buy at the airport that are like the moment that changed this or the moment that changed that. It's not really how historians think about it, right? We tend to see things as a continuum where lots of changes are happening all at once, and the merging of some of those changes is what leads to different paths and different outcomes, right? And so where Jonathan talks about, for example, the Facebook like button, which is kind of interesting, I want to read more about that. Like in my book, for example, one of the big changes that I talk about, which had a very big influence on not only how people understand the past, but also politics, was the way that imagery got privileged in the Facebook newsfeed. So it turned out in the mid to late 2000s that as more of us were using our cell phones and connecting to Facebook through the app, the largest percentage of uploads to Facebook were images. Right? So what did Facebook do? Well, they recognized that people wanted to use their app as a photo sharing platform, so they changed the newsfeed to privilege images. They made the images richer, more robust, wider on our screens, because that's what we wanted. And that allowed them to sell ads at greater premiums, because the ads then had more space and more real estate and were showing up in more people's feeds. And I write about in my chapter on on-demand nostalgia how this actually opened up an entire world of this basically nostalgia on demand that Facebook could give to you, whether it be on this day post or if you remember the app Time Hop, right? Resurfacing an image that had been in your feed the year before, the previous year, and how that really led us down a path of thinking about life symbolically and using images as a way to symbolically represent what we were up to at a given space, a given moment, a given time. And then when you apply that to politics, you think about how that works, right? Our politics are already so heavily symbolic, but it introduces a more heavily symbolic politicking that is then exploited by people like Duterte in the Philippines or Trump in the United States. And I only bring that up, I'm giving a cursory overview of it here. I encourage you to read my book I go more into it. But I bring that up just to say that I think there's a confluence of choices that happen. And it's not just on one or two platforms, right? There's also the invention of the infinite scroll. And how much does that change the way our attention gets grabbed and how we consume information and how we get overloaded by things like history or politics or news. So I think it probably is worthwhile for us to think about this not as like one or two or three switches that if we just turn them off, we're back to normal, right? It's a confluence of different things that we now have to not only sort out what exactly happened, but then chart the path moving forward.
Yeah. So I think I can add on to that and answer your question at the same time when you asked about, what should we be preserving it? So the most helpful way that I've found to think about what's happening to us is by turning to cyclical theories of history. So from ancient Greece through, there's a Muslim social scientist essentially in the 14th, 15th century, Ibn Khaldun, and some modern people. A lot of people have realized that societies, there's a rise and fall. There's a cyclicity about 80 to 100 years, about 4 generations. And what typically happens is one, we sort of, this is Strauss and Howe in the 1990s, like, there's spring, summer, fall, winter. There's a generation that goes through a crisis and emerges stronger, and they build institutions, and the country is dynamic and successful, and they pass it on to their kids. And the kids can, preserve it, but they're wealthier and safer, and not as tough. And then the institutions never last very long, especially in a rapidly changing society. And there's an internet meme about this. Hard times make strong men make good times make weak men make hard times. And I think there's some truth to that. I'll be curious what Jason thinks of this in a moment. But I bring it up here because we had to have a crack-up. No matter what happened, if Facebook never existed, we were due for a crack-up. But crack-ups are normal in history. We've had several in our 230, 50, whatever it is, years as a country. And so the way I think about it is the institutions built in post-war America after this extraordinary world war, never to be repeated, let's hope, in the age of mass media, which in human history has never existed and will never exist again. So the institutions that made America great, that made us the greatest country in the world by so many metrics, so many countries wanted to copy us, they copied our Constitution, let's do what they do. Those had an expiration date, and the expiration date is 3 or 4 generations. So we were due for a crack up, and several of the theories predicted, Peter Turchin specifically predicted 2020 as the year. He predicted this in 2010. He said we're due for a crack up in 2020. So crack-ups are normal. This is part of history and part of growth. Again, in this theory, maybe many historians don't accept this. So the way I'm thinking about it is the post-war American order did amazing things in the context of the Cold War. Of course, it did terrible things too, but it is what it is. It made us what it made us, and it couldn't last. The question is, how deep is this crack-up going to be, and what's going to be built afterwards? And if social media never existed, then I think it might just be a normal crack-up. It might just be like, we have to update our institutions, and it's not gradual, it'll be sudden, but we'll go through it and we'll go on to the next cycle. My fear is that what social media is doing to us, and I think Tristan Harris, if any of you are here for his talk, he's so good at talking about this, it both ramps up the intensity of the challenges while making us much, much stupider. We can't think. We have no capacity. We're deluded. We can't find truth. So it's like, if you're really old, like on 58, remember the show Beat the Clock? If you're very old, remember that show. It's like, okay, here's what you have to do. You have to throw this basketball in this hoop. It's not very hard. Oh, while blindfolded and upside down. Okay, so that's it. Like, okay, let's reinvent our institutions while we cannot find truth, while we hate each other, and while we're crazy.
So I think it was Václav Havel who said that, or he was quoting someone else who said that democracy is a horizon, right? You run towards it, but you never reach it, right? So this question about preserving democracy, well, do we really have democracy yet? I mean, do we have a true democracy when we still have voter suppression, when we still have people who are disenfranchised, when we still have participation rates in elections that are pretty low? Although I will say, to social media's credit, in 2018 and 2020, we had really high turnouts, 55% and 65%, I think, which was the highest since 1904. So social media can actually serve as a lever to democracy if utilized in certain ways. But I say that because, the story of American democracy is a very complicated one. And throughout the 250 years of this country, there have been people who have been barred from voting. There are people who have had voting rights that have then been taken away and then reinstated. And the line between democracy and authoritarianism is very, very slim. And their history is full of examples where countries have been a democracy, reverted to authoritarianism, and then went back to democracy, and then went back to totalitarianism again. So I think democracy is something that we strive for. And we strive it not just for in our political institutions, but in all of our institutions. How do we make things more inclusive? How do we get more people at the table? How do we allow more voices to be heard? How do we create a republic that really does include and reflect everyone's voices? I would argue that we've never yet done that. And so there are some parts of our republican democracy that we should get rid of, that we should abandon, voter suppression being one of them, racism and anti-Semitism being another one. And maybe there are ways that we can use social media to work towards a better democracy. I think that's sort of the project for all of us now as we look back on the previous 20 years and think forward for the next 20 years.
And I'm not trying to be the optimist kind of carrying the baton, because I do agree how deep some of these problems are. But if you look at the data and the statistics around our political dysfunction, the majority of the people are actually still largely in the middle, largely moderate, as are the majority of the politicians. So social media, of course, is amplifying the most polarized ends, and that's what algorithmic determination does, some of the fancy buttons that we discussed does. But doesn't that mean that if statistically the people who are actually as polarized are a small group, the majority of us are still here? There's still people that can carry us forward.
Yeah, most of the time when somebody tries to disabuse me of my pessimism, they cite like what the average person is like and the statistics on average people. Yeah, most people are great, most people are decent, most people want to live together. The problem isn't most people. The problem is that democracy is hard under any circumstance, and when you suddenly put us in this crazy funhouse where it doesn't matter what most people think, it's completely irrelevant except one day every other year, when it's all about changing the dynamics. So I'm listening to a podcast now. There's a new book out by Max Fisher called The Chaos Machine, I think is the title. So it's a great podcast where he talks about, he gives the example of mommy groups, mom influencers, blogs like mommy blogs. And he says, many of them just descended once they all got online, it was amazing, but they all pretty quickly descended into anti-vax stuff. Very few of them are anti-vax. But the dynamics of anything in which there are algorithms involved, or even not, just anything in which being a jerk or an extremist or a conspiracy theorist gets you more prestige or voice. So they all I don't know all, but many of them descended into that because that's what ends up getting front and center. And so this is my concern. Most people are reasonable. Under some circumstances, we could have an amazing democracy, but not under these circumstances.
So I'll throw some cold water on your optimism by saying that you probably could have said the same thing about people in the Weimar Republic, right?
I'm not
They're all-
necessarily rooting for the optimism. I'm just trying to throw
Right.
some in here.
These are all good
she,
people.
She works for Wired Magazine. That's like, that's like the community of people who still think that technology is going to save us.
Well, I think there are elements. I mean, listen, we need tech to solve our planetary climate change issue, right? We need green tech and solar tech and all these things. So I think there's a lot of room for tech to do good in this world. And our friend David back there is the one bringing all these responsible tech people together. But this is my point about the line between authoritarianism and democracy being so thin, right? In the Weimar Republic in the 1920s in Germany, you could have walked around and said, these are all decent people, hardworking, like to go out at night, appreciate their neighbors, and then boom, in the 1930s, there are laws being passed, Kristallnacht, Jews being sent off to concentration camps. It can happen quickly, and we've seen it even in Italy now, in the recent elections, right? You can walk around Italy and say, these are all decent people, they love their families, they love pasta, whatever. Well, they just elected a far-right government, which a lot of people have skepticism and concerns about. The line is very thin. Democracy requires diligence.
Well, it's not even clear that there's a line. I mean, I'm going to side here with Plato and with the founding fathers against democracy. That is, as I understand it, Plato said democracy is the second worst form of government because it inevitably descends into tyranny, because it means rule by the people, and the people are not going to be like, oh, let's all be philosophers on the hill. Plato thought philosophers should rule authoritarians. And the founding fathers didn't want democracy per se. The American experiment is not an experiment in democracy, it's an experiment in self-rule. That's the question, can we govern ourselves? And the essential element, it's government of the people, by the people, for the people. It doesn't mean democracy. It means ultimately the people have to be able to kick out the rulers if they're not satisfied with them. The people have to have some control. So what they gave us is a republic with democratic elements. And because they knew the problems of democracy, they were extremely well read. They were amazing historians and psychologists for their era. So I think I've always wondered, when did we begin to worship democracy? Was that Woodrow Wilson in World War I? But the founding fathers had a much more nuanced view. The question is, can we govern ourselves? And ultimately, distributed networks, which are possible with technology, should be compatible with amazing self-governance. There is a future in which we have the best self-governance ever, and everyone has a voice, and problems get solved, and it brings out our compassion and our humanity. And as we see here in this exhibit, the technology tends to have the effect of draining away our humanity, and dehumanization is not very compatible with the kind of country that we want. So just to close up here, what I'm saying is, let's stop talking about democracy. If you must talk about democracy, can you please always say liberal democracy? Because that's what we're talking about. It's the liberal is really what we're losing. We have democracy. Italy was a democracy. Trump's election was democracy is all around us. The question is, are we having liberal democracy or illiberal democracy? And I think that the current technology is pushing us much more towards illiberal democracy.
It seems like social media, well, we know, creates these performative dynamics. How different would the world be today if politicians, for example, weren't able to use social media?
So I'll just share one anecdote with you. So I testified. I was invited to testify at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on a bill that would force the platforms to at least share with researchers what the hell is happening, because we don't know. We have no access to the data. And so I was testifying by Zoom, and Senator Ossoff asked me, Professor Haidt, what effect do you think this is having? I was talking about teenagers. He said, what effect do you think this is having on our elected representatives? Do you think this is affecting the way they do their jobs? And I'd seen a photo. Ted Cruz had given some bombastic speech on the floor, and he sat down, and the photographer caught him. Like, he sits down, like, how am I doing on Twitter? So he was caught doing that. It was one of these funny moments on Twitter for a couple days. So I'm thinking of this, and I say, well, Senator, I think that if our leaders are more focused on their Twitter followers than on their own constituents or on the country as a whole, I think it's terrible. I think it's a violation of their duty, and I think this is a big problem for democracy. Okay, so then after the committee asked the questions, any senator who's in the room can ask a question. I didn't know it, but Ted Cruz was in the room. So he stands up and he asks a question. What is his question? A 5-minute diatribe about his Twitter followers, the numbers going up and down. That must mean censorship. So here we have a guy who's like, a candidate for president, or was and might be again. All he can think about is Twitter. So the answer to your question is, there is so many forces on our representatives, and we all know about the search for money and how much time they have to spend raising money. Now it's not just money. They have no other time practically, but they have to spend all of it pursuing their followers. Not all of them, but and some people have pointed out there is no way in hell that somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene would ever have become elected if not for this crazy social media environment. Because given our stupid, ridiculous closed primary system, the worst single feature of our electoral system, closed party primaries, no other country does this. It's so dumb. But in a closed party primary, the biggest jerk, the biggest person who attacks the other side can be a crazy person, but they can win.
And so do we not see this as a potential turnkey? If, for example, politicians not being on social media, because I do feel like you end up just governing for the people who follow you. You no longer have to do what you've been elected to do, which is govern for a diverse amount of people. You govern for 500 bots and then everybody else who follows you. Things like removing algorithms, removing a retweet or a like, or what Frances Haugen has said every, I think, third or fourth time you want to retweet something, you have to put the post in from scratch. Like, those are tangible things that we can change. But it seems like we're focused on things like censorship and false question marks around freedom.
Yes, I wish people would stop stop thinking that regulation means censorship. I get this all the time because people's imagination, it's like, well, the government is going to tell us what we can say. No, I don't care about content moderation. It's not very important, as Frances Haugen tells us. The issue isn't, can you say something? The issue is, why do we live in an incentive system where the jerkiest thing you can say is the thing that goes to millions of people? So Frances, I completely agree with Frances and with Tristan. It's all about the architecture. It's not about content moderation. So, there's a lot that we could do, and it's completely content neutral. I think the most important thing we can do is authenticate identities. You can still post with a fake name, but we're past the point where anybody in Russia can just open up 500 Facebook or Twitter accounts and pretend to be Americans. Like, at some point, we have to start caring about our country and our mental health. And so we're going to have to, if you want to sign up for a Facebook account, you're going to actually have to take 30 seconds and do something to establish that you're a real person in a real country and you're over 16 or 18.
Can I? Okay. So a couple things. First of all, funny Ted Cruz story. So I actually know someone in DC who worked for Ted Cruz, and apparently Ted Cruz is very, very obsessed with his Facebook page. And the reason is because that is where his father learns about what he's up to. So he makes sure that everything is posted on Facebook in its entirety, even if it's like a really, really long paragraph that no one would rightly click on, because allegedly, from what I was told, that is where his father follows his political career and gets his information, okay? So I say this because, again, I want to add a little bit of balance. Not that I don't agree with Jonathan for the bulk of what he's saying, because I do, but I just think rounding out the picture a little bit, right? Social media is one of the ways that constituents learn what their members of Congress are doing, and that is essential to democracy. Those members of Congress are there to represent us. And so it is their responsibility to let us know what they're doing, and we need to have a direct line of access to them. Now, of course, you could call your member's office, you could write them a letter, but it turns out that things like Facebook pages actually provide an entry point to many millions and millions of people around the country to communicate with their members of Congress and learn where their members of Congress stand on certain issues. Does that mean that Facebook is the best thing to happen to politics since sliced bread? No, but it does point out that I think there are elements of social media that can actually be democratic and good for democracy. And I also will point out, though, that access to members of Congress creates other problems. So I wrote a piece in my newsletter recently, maybe a few months ago now, and I forget the exact statistics, but because of social media and the access that constituents have to their members' offices are now being inundated with messages, sometimes tens of thousands of messages per year. So it's great. It opens up this line of communication between constituent and member, but then the member doesn't have the capacity to actually respond and read the messages with any clarity or substance. The staff are too overwhelmed. They end up spending most of their time trying to reply to Facebook messages as opposed to being in committees, working on legislation, and doing oversight. So it's a mixed bag, right? There's always more to the story, I feel like.
Could I just say, I think you're right, but I think there are many fewer benefits than it seems because people seem to confuse social media with the internet. I've heard so many people say, oh, you think that social media is so bad. Well, where would we have been in COVID? Like, can you imagine if kids didn't have social media? They would have been totally isolated. Yeah, imagine if all they had was telephone, texting, Zoom, Skype, multiplayer video games, and 100 other ways that they could do things together. Imagine if they would have been so much better off because synchronous communication is fantastic. And the internet was quite amazing before social media became popular. So imagine if our leaders, if the only way they could get the news out to us was blogs, web pages, email, things like that. So media, literally means what mediates between, source and target. So imagine if we had all this friction, this free mediation between our politicians and us that wasn't amplified by algorithms so that the extremists get all the attention and so that these politicians are flooded with messages. What percent are from their constituents? We don't know. It may not be very high because everybody can write to everybody and flood them with everything.
Yeah, I think there's a mixed bag there, but so the other thing I wanted to say to this question is that, we do live in a hybrid media environment, right? So it's not just social media. It's also cable news. It's also talk radio. It's also,
and those are very important for polarization. You're right.
100%. And, if there wasn't social media, then probably what members of Congress would do would just be more aggressive about getting on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News and putting out their talking points there, right? And I'll say this as a little bit of an anecdote. So C-SPAN, right? C-SPAN, great network. What was really interesting when I was researching the filibuster as part of these filibuster debates we've been having, right? So once C-SPAN came around, it actually increased the number of filibusters in Congress by a significant percentage. The reason was because members of Congress realized it was a great way to get on television and a great way to get exposure back to their constituents, to show their constituents at home that they were fighting the good fight, that they were arguing for their beliefs, that they were standing up to the other side. So we have this idea that we're going to broadcast Congress live so that constituents have more access to their members. And so what our members do is they say, I'm going to use this as a marketing opportunity. I'm going to stand up there and give all these big, long speeches, and then I'm going to cut the speeches up and send them back to my constituents to show them what I'm doing something as opposed to actually doing something, right? So I think that, again, this is something that historians always say all the time, we're like a broken record. I think it's more complex than just take away social media, because people who are in those positions will find other ways to manufacture the message and manipulate media in order to advance their objectives and their agendas. I think the way we get a better Congress and a better democracy is we elect different people. We've had some really bad people in Congress who have been there for 30 or 40 years, who maybe in their entire career have passed 1 or 2 pieces of legislation and spend the rest of their time fundraising, giving speeches on C-SPAN, and then tweeting. And that to me doesn't seem like a productive use of time or tax dollars.
And is it that we just elect different people, or are the circumstances in social media really influencing who's now getting elected? Like I don't think it's that we just don't have good options.
Yeah, so as a social psychologist who studies morality, my first move is always to say it's probably not the person, it's probably the situation. Now there is personality, there are some people who have personality disorders, but I've met a number of congressmen, I know people who know a lot of congresspeople, and most of them are really good people, and most of them go there because they want to make things better, and then they are all so frustrated. Yes, we have a system that now elects some people who are just showboating and who are crazy in some cases. So yes, there are some bad people, if you want to say that, but they wouldn't have been there if we had a saner system and if we didn't have social media and this sort of the hyper-viral craziness. So no, I would put almost all of my chips on changing the system, not on changing the people.
Yeah, so I definitely think the system needs change. I just don't think it's only social media that needs change. To your point,
you're right.
the ranked choice
That's right.
voting,
Yeah,
the party system, all the money in politics, all of that contributes.
Right, and polarization, we had an historically low period, a bizarrely low period of polarization in the mid-20th century because we had this strange system where there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and for a variety of historical reasons. So the mid-20th century was the anomaly. And then things begin to go up. In part, we get the sorting of the parties, but also because of cable TV in the late 80s, early 90s. So yes, a lot of the polarization predates social media, but I think it breaks through the sound barrier and the speed of light, and it goes completely ballistically crazy in the 2010s.
And so I want to ask, with viral and mob dynamics, I think cancel culture is completely unhealthy, unhelpful, and unproductive. It's having an enormous impact on our political communities, on our academic and institutions of scholarship. But at the same time, there's movements like the Me Too movement, which wouldn't have been so effective if it wasn't for social media. So how do we draw a line between discomfort and danger and the power social media provides us to mobilize, but also that same power to create mob dynamics?
Yeah. So I often get this question, and everybody points to BLM and Me Too. And my response is, okay, yeah, those movements definitely were more effective. They went further, faster because of the hyperviral dynamics. That's true. But you know what? You don't get to give these dynamics only to your favorite organizations. Everyone gets them. And the research shows social media mostly helps right-wing populists around the world. So whatever you want to do to speed up BLM and other movements, it goes double for QAnon, and so in the long run, it tends to push things to the right. The second thing is just think about it in terms of parameters. Okay, think about how much activism do you want? How fast should activists go from being angry to having an effect? Should we have a waiting period where maybe they should learn something about the thing they're trying to change, or should we just have I'm angry, I'm out there in 5 seconds? So there's some parameter, let's call it a throughput parameter for activism. And I think it shouldn't just be instant. I don't want activism to move at the speed of light. That's what we saw on campus, and that's what transformed us in 2015. And I'll just bring up a key idea in my Atlantic article was what I called structural stupidity. This is what happens when you get a group of smart people, or people of any intelligence, it doesn't matter, and you put them together such that nobody can question, that whatever the dominant view is, if anyone questions, says, well, now wait a second, this might backfire. Boom, you're dead, you're out of here. And shoot one, teach 1,000. I can't find whether that was Mao or the mafia, but it's a thing. Shoot one, teach 1,000. So being on campus, once you see, people, if you question anything about DEI, that people don't get canceled for saying racist things. They get canceled for questioning diversity policies. Now, people say terrible racist things on the internet, but on campus, it's really not a big thing. It's not a lot of professors screaming the N-word. It's really if someone questioned a DEI policy, boom, you're gone. And that teaches us, don't question DEI. And when you get that mindset, really stupid DEI policies get put in place, and people hate it. And guess what? One day, every 2 years, the people get to vote, and they tend to vote against the Democrats for that reason. So a lot of the things that seem to help left-wing activism backfire tremendously. And I don't think the Democrats have much of a future as long as social media is the way it is.
So there's a great book which I recommend reading. It's called The Rise of Digital Repression. It's by a friend of mine named Steve Feldstein. And so to pick up on John's point, which I think is an excellent one, we don't always get to control or choose who gets access to these tools and how they get used. And there's a disturbing trend of authoritarian regimes around the world using technology to repress people. And it's not just in China, which is the first obvious example that comes to mind. This is happening in Thailand, it's happening in Saudi Arabia, it's happening in Iran, it's happening in Ethiopia. It's a huge growing problem and trend around the world. And as more authoritarian leaders get elected or assume power by other means and gain access to the tools to repress and wield power and stifle and dissent, it creates really alarming conditions for pro-democracy advocates and activists around the world. And it also breeds, extremism and other terrible things that lead to violence and political chaos. And so we have our work cut out for us when it comes to these tools that get rolled out, these platforms that get adopted en masse, and then what are the unintended consequences of that. And this is one of the things that I've struggled with in my brief foray into this, because as new products or platforms have been launched, I've been invited into a few of these conversations with engineers and venture capitalists and others. And it's always about, to the point Jonathan was making earlier, the positive that this tech is going to do. This thing is going to be great because it's going to revolutionize X, Y, Z, and it's going to make things better for all these people. And no one wants to be that voice in the room that says, have you considered how this could be used for another purpose, right? Have you thought about building in safeguards? But building in the safeguards slows down the process of getting to market. It scares off funders. It makes people hesitant to invite you back. So it's like a little bit of a mild form of cancellation, right? But that's, I think, where we need to get to. And again, I salute David for the work that he does with bringing together an ethical tech community where you can have people in the room talking about these things as platforms and technologies get developed. So they don't just get rolled out en masse so quickly, adopted by everyone, and then we turn around and say, oh, we shouldn't have done that, right? And that's my big concern right now with TikTok. It's just been rolled out so quickly, so aggressively, adopted so widely, so en masse, so quickly, we really have no idea what ByteDance is up to, right? And maybe they're not up to anything, but they might be up to something, right? They own a lot of companies, they're in the AI space, they're in the health space, they're operating out of China. We just don't know, and yet it's been so quickly rolled out and adopted, and I just worry we're gonna find ourselves in another situation where down the line we're going to say, oh man, we really should have built in some safeguards. We really should have thought more carefully about that before we just all downloaded it onto our phones.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, because we're probably getting somewhere near the end of this part of the conversation. I should probably show some optimism and some hope. I've learned that if you actually want to motivate people, it's probably better to not just be doom and gloom, but doom, gloom, and then hope. If we all just come together and do X, then so there are actually some hopeful things, and one of them is actually, as Jason was just saying, like things were built without safeguards. It was just a rush to monetize attention, and so I've begun working. There's a big project, a thing called Project Liberty. Frank McCord has funded this group. If you go to projectliberty.io, and the way Frank talks about it is, Web 1 was this amazing thing, like, wow, you can find all this information. Web 2 was this complete disaster that's destroying democracy and teen mental health and all sorts of things. Web 3 is coming, and I don't play golf. I suppose a mulligan is you get to do it over if you did something stupid. I don't know, but anyway, he says we get one mulligan in the next decade or two, one chance to do it over. And so where Web 2, it was like, how about no safeguards? How about no, Kara Swisher says, to Mark Zuckerberg, you built a city and you plastered it with ads and you didn't even think about a police force, fire department, or hospitals? But so no, how about if we do that this time? And so, so the idea is Project Liberty has there's a white paper on, because this is all, if Web3 is going to be largely based on blockchain, different architectures, which make possible things about controlling your information that aren't possible in Web 2. With blockchain, you can let things out and take it back and trace it. So I certainly don't understand the technical details, but My pessimism is about our current technological environment. And if we don't make major changes, then I believe we will fail as a country catastrophically within 1 or 2 decades. However, we're going to do something. I mean, this is what Americans have always done. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville said about us in the 1830s, is when something needs to be done, in France or in England, people will say, well, let's wait for the king to do it. Let's wait for the nobles to do it. But in America, they say, well, let's meet down by the river and figure out how we're going to build a bridge here. So that is my hope, that we are very close to this singularity, as some people call it. We're over a cliff, whatever metaphor you want to use. But there are different technological futures possible. And so if we really focus, I mean, as you're coming out guardrails, that's what really activated this. If we think about what kind of technological environment would be compatible with liberal democracy, there are some. And then if we think about what kind of behaviors we can do that would be compatible with retaining our humanity in this degraded dystopian space, like, for example, let me suggest something. Here's my rule. I never, ever engage with anyone on social media. I post things because I use it as a tool and I read things. But the idea of having a conversation on Twitter, don't do that. Nobody should do that, because that's what they want. They want you to fight in the Coliseum. So, if there's a conflict with someone, I'll email them privately. And they usually don't want to talk because they wanted to perform. They didn't want to talk. But we can change our behavior so that we don't go along. Remember, you're the product on these. You're not the customer. You're the product. So don't be the product. And you're a human being. Treat other people like human beings. Don't get angry. Don't take offense. Don't give offense. I think that's the only way we can make it through this.
Yeah, I think responding to a few points, is the default setting to most of the digital technologies today is surveillance, and that's how most of them operate. But yes, there is a hope with innovation such as blockchain. So I do think the pipeline of technology could potentially be helpful, but we can't just rely on defaulting to the future. I do think regulation is the only thing that's going to get us out of our current social media situation. Otherwise, you're calling into question capitalism and reporting to Wall Street. That's a bigger disruption that needs to happen. But I do think we can regulate our way out of this current nightmare. I do believe that that's possible. But what can individual citizens, like not responding, of course, in comment is one thing, but what can we be aware of in terms of the dynamics of social media and our tendency to just perform? Like, how can we operate differently outside of just the comment thread?
So, we're all stuck in what's called the social dilemma. That's why Tristan and his crew called that movie The Social Dilemma. It's one of the central concepts in the social sciences, that you can be in a situation where each person pursuing their self-interest ends up collectively dooming the whole group. So the technology companies have put us in that. And so, the obvious thing for parents of teenage girls is just don't let them on Instagram. And sometimes I've said that. But I have to be more nuanced and say, if everybody is on Instagram and your daughter is the only one who's not, that can be very hard. Now, if she has 1 or 2 friends, then you can do it. So you have to think your way out of this. So the point is, recognize that we're in a social dilemma, and it's often very hard to solve this on your own. It's a collective action problem, and so you have to come together in groups. I think our first focus should be on middle schools. There is no reason why we should be allowing 10, 11, 12-year-old kids to lie about their age and have platforms that are clearly damaging to their health. So I think that should be a no-brainer to get these things out of middle school. So that would just be an example of, in your community, just work on the middle school. And New York City Public School, or at least my daughter's school, thank God, they finally put in these yonder pouches so that now all the kids have their, because it used to be, well, just keep your phone in your pocket and just don't take it out. Yeah, keep your heroin or your needle in your pocket. Just don't shoot up in the bathroom. But now they're in these yonder pouches, and so it's like you can scratch at it and bang at it all you want, but you're not getting your phone out. I'm saying, yes, I totally agree. Ultimately, regulation is needed to break the social traps. That's why I'm focused on that. But until that happens, that could be a very long time at the congressional level. Actually, there's a lot going on in the states and attorneys general, so there are good things happening. But focus not just on what you do as an individual, but on what communities you can affect. And like with everything else in social psychology, if you're the oddball out, you're the only one, you're a freak. But if you get 7 respected people to do it, suddenly it's cool to not be on Instagram. I think people, and I see professors who post, they should be ashamed of themselves. because Twitter's the exact opposite of academic thinking. How about if we just, be angry with no context and no accountability? That's a terrible idea. It warps professors' minds. So, be sensitive to these traps, find groups that you can opt out with, and try to create better environments to interact.
And one thing we know about history, about liberal democracy, is that it does require shared stories and shared histories. What could be the shared story that we can all subscribe to in this decade?
Well, I think we're in the process of sorting through a new shared story for the United States, and I think that's a healthy process because a lot of the story about this country that we had up until the last few decades and maybe even more recently was not really democratically created, right? Most professional historians in the past have been people who looked like me. And it's only recently that other people, other voices, other ethnicities and races and genders have been able to come into the history profession and write their stories into the narrative. And as a result, there's been contestation about that. Obviously, 1619 Project being sort of the most obvious example, but there have been others, Confederate monument debates, Christopher Columbus debates, all kinds of various debates that happen at the local level, the Silent Sam statue at UNC, if people remember that. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing. I think for, history, the past is not a static place. Our understanding of the past is always changing. It's always being rethought and contested. And it's rethought and contested because different people are coming to the table asking different questions, because our present moment requires us to ask different questions, and because we get new sources of information which change the way we see the past. A very obvious example of this would be Cold War historians, right? For now, records that were classified for the past 50, 60 years are suddenly being unclassified, declassified. And so that makes Cold War historians go back and say, oh, you know what? Actually, we now know more about what China was doing or what East Germany was doing than we did before. We need to revise. We need to rethink. As more Black scholars, Hispanic scholars, LGBT scholars come into the academy, they say, listen, I don't see our history reflected in this American story. I'm going to write it in. And I'm going to write it in a prominent place, not as like an afterthought or an aside or a little text box. I'm going to put it right at the front of the page. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a really good thing in particular because we're coming up on our 250th anniversary in 2026. And I think we do have an opportunity, this synergy between history and tech and social media and diverse voices and all these different stories. I think we have an opportunity to rewrite and recast a different American narrative that is more inclusive, more accurate, more representative of who we are and where we've been and where we're going. And I think we should embrace that.
So I'd like to sort of agree and disagree in a certain way, because I think we were telling that story up until around 2014, 2015. It's the story that Barack Obama told. And I'm going to tell it again from my perspective, which is I was born in 1963, 2 months after Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, which means I was born 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. In that 100 years, how much progress did we make on race relations and equality? Some, but not a lot, not 100 years worth of progress. So that's 1963. Now go up to 1973. How are things going for civil rights, women's rights, gay rights? Go to 1983. Animal rights, environmental rights, human rights, everything. Decade by decade, the progress is extraordinary. The greatest progress towards equality, openness, towards the things you're talking about, the greatest progress I believe any country has ever made in history. I'm sure there are exceptions, but just go with me on this. So that goes all the way up to 2013. So the first 50 years of my life were the most extraordinary progress. If you are a progressive, if you believe in social justice, you're sitting in 2013, you should be saying, yay, America. Whatever we've been doing, it's incredible. We should be celebrating. What a country. Yes, we were founded by hypocrites who owned slaves, but my God, what we've done. And this is the story that Barack Obama told. And this is the story that brings together the center-left, center-right, center. This brings together 80% of the country, this story. This is the story we were telling. In 2013, our first African-American president had just been reelected. Most of the gay marriage bills that were proposed passed. So in 2013, you should be saying, go America, just keep going. And instead, what happened? Because of the fragmentation, we have this crazy woke left saying everything is and always was and always will be white supremacy. You have NPR stopping reading the Declaration of Independence. They used to read the Declaration of Independence every year. They stopped that because of woke employees who are upset, like, no, it's a racist document, don't read it. So we have the crazy left saying, no, I reject the Barack Obama story. I embrace the story of America's original sin, which is unerasable and it will always be terrible. And then in reaction, you get this crazy right turning to what's now called national conservatism. Conservatism in every age is a reaction to the excesses of the left. There's no such thing as conservatism as an ideology. It's always, and here I'm drawing on the historian Jerry Mueller, it is always a reaction to what is perceived as the excesses of the left, and that's happening today. Read Tom Edsall's most recent column, an incredible column in the New York Times on the national conservative movement. It's exactly a reaction to the extreme elements of the left, tearing down, pulling down statues of George Washington, tearing off Abe Lincoln's name. So I guess what I'm saying is we had that story, and it was a damn good story. And as far as historical stories go, it was pretty close to the truth. I mean, of course, thank you. But I think social media has fragmented things so much and elevated the far left and the far right that the story is no longer possible. I do not think we will find one that can satisfy the two sides.
May I disagree respectfully?
I hope you will.
All right, so I think a couple things. First of all, those narratives, those ideas, those have been around since the 1960s. I mean, there was a whole school of historians, one of the terminologies for it is sort of Whiggish history, right? This idea of American progress, that we're always pointing in the right direction. And that historiography was very popular, especially in the post-war era when America emerged victorious, 1940s, 1950s. And in the 1960s, the new left came around, and they called themselves the revisionists. They were led by Howard Zinn, who some of you are probably familiar with, but there's others as well. And they basically said that, that story that we've been telling ourselves in the 1940s, 1950s, and beforehand is not fully accurate. I mean, if you look at some of these other groups, these other ideologies, other ethnicities, that story doesn't really hold up. And so I don't see it as it's suddenly emerging in 2013. It's been in the historiography since 1968. I mean, if you read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which came out, yeah, it's a great book. I read it in high school. Came out in 1980. It actually sold more copies in the early 2000s than it did when it first came out in the 1980s, because Zinn sort of became this hero in sort of speaking out against the Iraq War in the early 2000s, and his ideas sort of picked up more steam there. So again, I don't tend to see history as these inflection points where suddenly in 1 year everything changed and we fell off a cliff. These ideas have been brewing in the historiography, in the literature, in the scholarship, among activists and among media for generations, for at least 50 years. And I think there have been a number of different circumstances that have allowed them to bubble up to the surface and sort of gain more currency in the popular imagination than maybe they did before. But I don't see that as a bad thing. To me, as a historian, history is a constant process of revision. And that revision is in part based on new sources, but it's also based on new voices. And so if new voices are asking harder questions about our country, harder questions about our founders, harder questions about our founding documents, did we actually really mean what we said when we wrote this thing back in 1776? I think that should be embraced. I don't see that as a problem. I see that as a strength. And I think there are so many places around the world where you can't do that, where that type of speech is stifled and suppressed. And the fact that we have that ability here, that to me is what makes America great. That is what democracy is all about. And so I embrace that. I embrace those hard discussions. And I actually do think that we're going to come out on the other side with a much stronger sense of identity and American self, which may be different from the one that you and I grew up with, but that's okay. I'm not afraid of it.
I think that's more or less a great place to wrap up. So in a really quick final summary, what would you say gives you hope right now? And I'll start that we can diagnose the problem, largely. I know that there's still a lot of question marks, but if we were in 2016, 2017, it was just a chaotic storm, and we really couldn't understand the forces that were being taken out from under us. Now I think we can diagnose it, and that's at least a step towards a solution or a brighter future. What about you guys?
My hope is always in people. And people like John and Project Liberty and the work they're doing, people like David with All Tech is Human, people like John, people like yourself, all the people in this room. I think if you look at American history and you look at the American story, you look at the history of tech, yeah, it's about machines and big political machinations, but ultimately it's a story of people, right? And people making choices and having agency. And I believe in people's ability to make choices, to have agency, and I don't believe that our history is cyclical and that we're predestined to some sort of outcome every few years. I think we have a lot of agency and a lot of power if we choose to use it and choose to mobilize it. And it's because of the people who are creating spaces and forums like this that we begin to mobilize that power and put it into action. So that gives me hope.
So I guess what gives me hope, this will sound kind of strange to say, but what gives me hope is the recognition that I'm probably wrong. And what I mean by that is, so two good friends of mine are Phil Tetlock, who's done a lot of work on forecasting and has shown that it's almost impossible to predict the future. And if you look at experts in the 80s predicting the Soviet Union or the Chinese economy, everybody got everything wrong practically. And we tend to think like, I am so immersed in these trends, what's happening to Gen Z, what's happening to democracy. And if you draw the trend lines out, it looks completely disastrous. And so I'm caught up in that, and I'm writing 2 books on different pieces of the puzzle. But I'm probably wrong, because you can't predict the future. God knows what's going to happen next year or 2 years from now. And my other good friend who writes about this is Steve Pinker, and also Matt Ridley, a number of people who've been writing about how in every era people think things are going to hell and the golden age was behind us, and now everything's done for. And they've always been wrong, although sometimes they were right for a little while. But the course of history has been ever upwards. And that is the human spirit, that is human creativity, that is our basic decency within tribalism. We are evolved for tribalism. We're very good at doing conflict, but we're also very good at making peace and doing trade. Traditional societies are great at trade. So as an academic now, I'm trying to work, as a social scientist, I'm trying to work out what the hell is happening to us, and it looks really bad. But I'm probably wrong, and that gives me hope.
I'm not sure if you want to open it up for questions.
Well, I'm going to have to disagree respectfully with Jason regarding his advocacy of the 1619 Project. And in the interest of full disclosure, I will mention that one of my college professors was Gordon Wood. Wood was one of a group of historians who challenged the New York Times on its historical accuracy. And I agree to a major extent to the criticisms that he and his colleagues had. I think fundamentally, my biggest problem, and I speak as someone who, although not a historian, is someone who respects the techniques of historians, is that the New York Times did not use historians to establish the 1619 Project, but instead ideologically inspired journalists to craft their narrative. And I think that was a grave mistake. And I'm also fundamentally an optimist. I would like to think that our country was not founded on slavery, but because of the desire, the need to seek individual liberty. And that's something you'll see with the Pilgrims, you'll see to the arrival of the Puritans, to the arrival of other groups that came in the United States with, unfortunately, of course, the notable exception of Black slaves. And I will agree to a point that we need to understand more of that history, but I disagree vehemently in the need to rewrite it to such an extent that it conforms to the 1619 Project.
So I was actually working inside of an academic institution when the 1619 Project came out, and I can tell you that a part of the reaction, the visceral reaction from historians, was just what you said. How come we weren't invited to participate in this, right? And so it wasn't so much about the content, it was kind of like the stab to the ego of, man, how could the New York Times put this out and not include more of us, especially when we've been working on these issues for decades. In terms of the accuracy of the project, I mean, I think the biggest thing that historians have argued with, and I agree with most historians on this point, is there was a piece in there that talked about the American Revolution, and the American Revolution was fought to defend slavery. Most historians disagree with that. That's just inaccurate as far as most historians are concerned. And that was the piece that got a lot of historians up in arms, and there was a letter, a reply to it. But I will point out that the original project that came out was a full magazine issue. And most people I've talked to have not actually read that full magazine. They have very strong opinions about the project without actually reading it. But if you read the essays, some of them are terrific. In fact, I'll point you to one. Matthew Desmond, who's a sociologist up at Harvard, has a terrific essay in that original magazine. There's also a really interesting essay, I forget who wrote it, about fashion. And a lot of that stuff was not new to historians, because it was stuff that had been in the historiography and been in the scholarship for decades. The problem is a lot of people don't read historical scholarship or are well-versed in historiography. So to a general public, it was a bit shocking and surprising. I will say this, though. My own quibbles with the project aside, I have no problem with its existence, right? And I think that's one of the areas of debate that have surfaced around this project. Should it have happened at all? Is this, some sort of takeover of the history profession, the historical narrative? I don't see it that way. That's just me. You're free to disagree. I think it's great that we have these types of arguments in the public sphere. I think it's great that we can have these types of discussions. And again, many of the essays in that original 1619 magazine were excellent, so I encourage you to read them.
It's great to have it as a magazine issue that provoked a lot of controversy and discussion, but then how can the New York Times push it as a thing to teach schools?
Well, I think the trick is using it as a supplement to a curriculum, not as the curriculum itself, right? And I think the reason we have professional historians who teach history courses or history teachers who stay up to date on the historiography is so that when a project like this comes out, it can be used as a discussion point. It can be used as a way to say, hey, look, take this project and compare it to what you read in your textbook or in this book or that book.
My kids go to New York City public schools. Nobody dares have that discussion.
Well, I would say this, that's not the 1619 Project's fault, right? I think having this information out there in the public domain is not in itself a bad thing or a crime. Now, how it gets used and how it gets implemented, that's sort of taking it a step beyond. But I personally have no problem with there being a 1619 Project. My historiographical quibble with the project would have been, I thought it was a missed opportunity to do a more transnational history, to talk about the slave trade as a transatlantic slave trade that involved the African coast, South America, the Caribbean, and the United States, and to make that linkage more clear for readers. I thought that was a missed opportunity, and had they actually brought in more historians, I think that would have surfaced.
Thank you so much again to John and everyone for the program. And to curriculum, and we were due for a crack up. So I heard you say we're due for a crack up, but we also obviously need curriculum. I'm an entrepreneur residence at Harvard Business School, and we're literally working on Web3 curriculum programs and how to teach the next generation of Harvard MBAs. So I'd like your feedback. What should we do?
Well, so I would just say the most important thing, especially in academic context, is to beware of structural stupidity. And by that, what I mean, as I said before, any discussion of anything that touches on politics, race, gender, is going to be held in a field in which one side will say things and no one dares challenge them. So what you get is the usual BS that people recognize as BS and rebel against. So don't have many discussions out in the open, don't have transparency, do it behind closed doors where people can actually talk honestly, and come up with a product and then put it out there. And recognize that you sometimes will get pushback, especially on social media, but don't take it too seriously. So it's very hard. I mean, this is one of the main things I'm working on these days is we desperately need social science research. We desperately need universities to be guiding us through these difficult areas. And since a lot of that is broken because of structural stupidity, a lot of what we put out is nonsense. So that would be my main advice.
A lot of the criticisms, I guess, of social media, like I think one of the main mechanisms you pointed out was you put people in a room, like basically the craziest or wildest voices will get amplified, and that's how people will get more likes, shares, retweets, etc. But I guess I wonder how much of this is more just a reflection of society and a reflection of what people like and want to see. Because if this were true of only social media, obviously, then it wouldn't be true of cable news. But it is true in cable news that the more radical you are, the crazier you are, the more attention you get. That then extends to politics and or politicians in other areas. So it really seems like the incentives are made for you, no matter who you are, whether you're on social media, whether you're a public figure, like whoever you are, you're incentivized to be crazy because that's what people seem to react to. But that sounds like a people problem. That's not a social media problem, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I would disagree with that because it's not, a flat mirror reflects what's there, but a distorting mirror that only picks out certain fringes is not really reflecting humanity. It's giving us a distorted image, then feeds back and changes people's perception of who their fellow citizens are and of what's popular. There's a really wonderful article from 1973. A West German political scientist wrote an article called The Spiral of Silence. And she says, we have like a quasi-statistical organ in our minds that's always tracking public opinion. And in a room, you can, like here, I can kind of read the room and get a sense of whether the room's against me or not. But on social media, you have no idea. And then what happens is it's going to be extremely with you, extremely against you. And that has no relationship to what most people actually think. So social media is not a mirror. It's not just holding up or amplifying our tendencies. It's distorting it and creating something that wasn't there before in many cases, I would say.
I totally agree. Social media, it's not a mirror at all. And I think it's hard for us. I'm a millennial, maybe you're millennial, Gen Z as well. We've been born in a time when social media and cable kind of bounce back between one another. And so I think we do almost have to trust what happened pre-social media, people that were alive to see it wasn't always this way. Because I think now for us, we look at cable and it looks just as chaotic as somebody's Twitter feed.
Because so much of it is now about Twitter.
There we go. Politicians ban Twitter. Okay. Anyways, final question. Sure, here.
You've talked a lot about the need for behavior change in addition to some of the systemic changes. I'm a therapist, I'm a psychologist as well, a clinical one. And whenever something political happens in the news, like the Roe v. Wade announcement, for example, I find myself actually leaning on your work, the article with Greg Lukianoff, Caught in the American Mind, have them work through distortions, behavioral activation. Ann Lemke, a psychiatrist at Stanford, has come out, if you fast from social media for 30 days, your brain should reset. Do you know of any groups that are trying to disseminate those practices amongst clinicians? Because I feel like that could be one way to institutionally move the needle. And I've been kind of making it up a little bit just because I haven't been able to find anything just through Google or through an archive.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. There's so much attention to kids. There's so many movements, wait until 8th, to keep phones till 8th, to get kids off. But we're generally more reluctant to tell adults what to do. So I haven't heard much. What you're suggesting is actually therapists should be talking about this. I think the sense about 5 years ago that social media is a tool and it can have good parts and bad parts, that was very pervasive until a couple of years ago. I think it's very recently that we're realizing this is completely driving us bonkers. And so I think that if you were to put up a flag or start calling out to other therapists, or do something at APA, I quit APA because of the crazy politics. But if you were to go to APA and try to get other therapists to join you in this, I think actually that's a very good idea.
Thank you for this. I'm actually up here for two reasons, not just to close, but two reasons. One, Jason made this great thank you to me as a leader and what he said at the beginning, and I was standing in the back while everybody applauded, and I just like to take that in here on stage. So. This has been a lot of work, by far more than I had expected. And It's just been a step-by-step process, and just like, if I had thought 6 years ago when I began, how much this would have taken energetically from me, I don't think I ever would have done it. And so there's something to be said by step, and don't look too far into the future. And I don't want to be afraid to receive that applause because it really helps me out. The second reason I'm up here, thank you. And then the second reason I'm up here is really just to thank them. Thank you so much for making this such a special night. Really, thank you.